Okay, so now that we are all more humble, we're going to talk about how we get to I don't know. And I want to start with a story of a Zen master and a very learned professor that comes to visit him. Maybe some of you know this story. So the professor goes up to the top of the mountain and the Zen master offers him tea. And the professor says, oh, yes, he'd like some tea. And he started telling the master all that he knew. And as the master's pouring the tea, he just keeps pouring, pouring, pouring. And the professor says, what are you doing? And he said, well, your mind is like this overfilled teacup. There's so much in there, nothing can come in. And so we're going to talk about what our teacups might be filled with. What I call this part of the class is learning about our human operating systems, so OS in computer terms. And so we're going to educate ourselves and about others. And there's three main points. None of what I talk about is comprehensive. There's more, but I've tried to pull out what I think is the most important. So the first area is our neurobiology. The second area is our mental and cognitive operating systems. And the third is psychological. So all of these things I'm going to talk about are features, not bugs. They're programmed. That's how we're human. That's part of how we are. They're automatic. We're wired to be this way. And we need to become self-aware. Like Brandy, her example, we catch ourselves in the act with as much self-compassion or humor as we can. And then at some point, maybe we do a manual override and we act differently. But I can't emphasize this enough, that we are actually going against our own biology to do this kind of work. It's a big deal, and it takes courage and stamina. And it behooves each of us to understand and make a map of our own personal individual operating systems. In other words, as they used to say, know thyself. And in that, and doing that, we also get to understand others better also. So neurobiology, I'm going to talk about being triggered and our defense mechanisms. So I think being triggered at this point is so much in our common parlance that most people have been exposed to the word. That wasn't true maybe 10 years ago. But it has to do with having very strong reactions. And sometimes when you are able to look at it more dispassionately, you see that maybe it was a stronger reaction that was warranted by the current event. It's connected to our survival instincts, our nervous systems. It happens in emotional, physical, and instinctive ways. As I said, it's wired. It's part of our human nature. It's a knee-jerk reaction. And the other thing that happens is it hijacks our ability to think clearly. So when we're triggered, and you may have had this experience, if you think of a time you were panicked, when we're triggered in this way, we literally can't think. I really want to highlight this effect on our nervous system. When I have taught this in the past, and even working on myself, when I think of it in terms of what's happening to my nervous system versus how am I feeling or what's happening emotionally or psychologically, people report to me that's a lot easier to zero in on what their nervous systems are feeling. It's actually, and it actually kind of can get away from a lot of the story and trying to figure things out, just to know that your nervous system is worked up, dysregulated, whatever. And what we're actually trying to do, and this is a lifetime's work, right? We're attempting to rewire ourselves. So as mammals, we're wired for threat detection. And whether it's real or imagined, we react the same. And this is the most central drive we have, is to go towards safety and away from danger, however unconscious or automatic that is. And we're always moving towards what our nervous system feels as safe and away from what it feels as unsafe or dangerous. The problem is now a lot of that reactivity is maladaptive. I think somebody's got their microphone on. You can turn it off, please. There's also something called the negativity bias. We're going to go more into biases, but we are wired to always be on the lookout for what could go wrong so we can strategize to keep ourselves safe. And the other thing that it's really important to understand about this is that we are really easy to manipulate. Advertising, media, partyism, politicians, spam or con artists, what do they all have in common? Often is they scare us and then they tell us what they're going to do to make us safe. And it's really important to understand when you're being manipulated because it's a very powerful unconscious move. Like we saw in the video last time, that opposing ideas or ideological threats can be experienced neurobiologically as physical threats. And there's two quotes I have. One is from a scientist. She says, "The problem is your body can't tell the difference between a viewpoint threat and a bear." And the journalist Chris Mooney said, "We apply fight or flight reflexes not only to predators, but to data itself." So it's just, I'm trying to give you a lot of different ideas so that when something happens, you're going to have ways of filtering, like, oh, am I being manipulated right now? Am I really in danger right now? Is this just an idea that I'm interpreting as a threat? Or what? There's another survival instinct, which we could do a whole day on, and that is to belong. And evolutionary wise, banishment from the tribe equals death, and we're still wired like that. A lot of people in the depolarization world feel like this is the main driver now. So it's important not to underestimate the power of the fear of not belonging and in-group, out-group affiliation. It's a really huge driver. And it's really playing out in our politics today. I'll give you a little personal example that in the beginning, when I got into the political bridging world, because I was presenting viewpoints from all kinds of sides, people would sometimes call me an ideologue. I won't say which side, but they were angry, they were upset. Some of you have seen me in action in town here and know what I'm talking about. But at the beginning, I would get so freaked out and I would wake up at night anxious, having these panic attacks, thinking I'm going to lose the house. I'm going to lose my house. But my work, I don't mostly get paid for my work at all. I don't have a shop people can boycott. There's really nothing but I had to really talk myself off the ledge and say, wait a minute, this is what I'm talking about when we have reactions that aren't anchored in current reality. They might have something to do with our past. So it's really important to know. So once we get triggered, then our defense mechanisms come online. And we all have our favorites. And in longer workshops, what I have is a list, a couple page list of different defense mechanisms. And I ask the participants to pick their 5 favorites and to talk about them. But I will be sending you that list that you can do at home if you want, or do it with your spouse, or a friend. It could be fun and interesting. It's really important to understand ourselves and what we do when we're feeling defensive. And a part of this is what they call the 4 Fs. And many of you know the fight or flight, which I mentioned before. More recently, they added on freeze, which is the deer in the headlights. And one man I know writes about this, and I think he's right about this. He calls it fawn, which is kind of the Stockholm syndrome. When you lean into people that you are feeling threatened by, you want to get on their good side kind of thing. So just to give you an example, my lineup is this. The first thing I do is freeze. And what I've learned to do is when I freeze, I understand that I'm freezing and I move. I move my arm or I step to the side, I try to break the freeze response, and it really helps. My second one is fawn. So I'll try to get on, somebody's good side. So they'll be, nice to me. And then I'll do flight, or I'll, change the subject at least, or I'll fight if I really have to. Now, I'm not saying that defense mechanisms and the 4 Fs are always bad. They're not, but to the extent we're not in control of them, they're not useful, they're not helpful, and they can be counterproductive. Part of what happens when we're triggered and defensive, it's really hard, if not impossible, to really discern what's going on. As we said, you can't think, and we don't know what's real and what's imagined. So I'm just going to give a lot of personal examples because I think those are the best way to talk about something. I sometimes, I'm trying not to do this, but at night, sometimes I look at my emails. It's really, really not a good idea, Marla. Don't do it anymore. But if there's what I experience as a challenging email, I get worked up, and I might get anxious, or I might get angry, or I might, grumble to myself or out loud or to the cat. And what happens so often is I used to respond right away, big mistake, because I wanted to get it out of my inbox, literally and metaphorically. Now what I do is I sleep on it. And 9 times out of 10, I reread that email or the text and I go, how did I possibly take this badly? I see it completely different eyes. And the other thing that I've learned about myself is that I used to think that either I was objectively, this person was being a jerk and I was objectively right, or I felt really like I had to be nice, like, oh, he's probably having a hard day himself or something like this. And I've changed, and I think this is important, is one of the things that I don't like to think of myself as being, that I can feel ashamed about, is unreasonable. And being angry at people in the way I was raised is unreasonable. And now I let myself have that. So along with reading this triggering email at night, I'll let myself grumble and vent and journal if I need to, and I get it out. And I know there's some thoughts, some worldviews that say, oh, even negative thoughts are a bad thing to have because it goes out into the world. And I don't believe that. I think we're humans, we get irritated, there's frictions, it's part of being, everyday life. There's got to be a safe space to have those feelings. And I've known this thing for years to do it that way. I've only really been doing it the last few years. It's made a world of difference because it cleans the slate. It's like shaking the Etch-a-Sketch, if you ever did that as a kid. So without hurting anybody and just getting that energy out. Some of you might have watched that Jim Tam video that was given as homework. It's 15 minutes, I think. It's really good. And so those of you who haven't seen it, I suggest that you do. It gives a really smart overview of defense mechanisms and ways to work with them. So when I get triggered these days, I realize the first step I have is I realize I'm triggered, where before I thought I was in reality. I was in absolute reality. So I realize I'm triggered. I tell myself, there's no knife to my throat. This is not life or death in the moment. And often I'm in the time machine. Like I told the story about Max, my son, and the homework, where I got triggered with him and I felt ashamed. And I can know I'm in the time machine and it's not absolute current reality. And all of that, the best I can without beating myself up, with having some self-compassion or maybe some humor. And I get less triggered now and it lasts shorter. It's not that I'm through with that. I never will be, but it's better. The other thing I want to talk about is something called homeostasis, which I don't think I mentioned last time. So it's a scientific word. It means basically how our organisms are primed to always try to get back to calm, to equilibrium, to balance. And that being triggered is a sign that we're out of balance, and our defenses are one of the ways we try to get in balance, but it doesn't really work. I'm not a big meditator, but some people say meditation helps them self-regulate. I think this non-judgmental awareness really does also help to self-regulate and to stay calm. I know that anecdotally, I think I've done 3 or 4 sets of 8-month courses. And most of the students say their takeaways are they're more able to say that they don't know about things, about something, and they're less triggered. And I think those 2 things are really, really moving. It really moved me to hear that. If that's all this class does, I can die happy. So having said all that, with these being triggered and defenses, we need to start delaminating our behaviors from these survival mechanisms and instincts. Viktor Frankl, who was a concentration camp survivor, said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and freedom. So by cultivating humility and cultivating calm, we start developing the capacity to step into that space. This is a philosophical question, but for me, that space is the space of free will. If we have any at all, that's the space. So the next thing I want to talk about in terms of our operating systems are our cognitive and our mental operating systems. And I want to introduce you to a writer named Adam Grant, who's one of my favorites. He wrote in the last few years a book called Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. And it's a great book, along with the other book I recommended, Being Wrong by Catherine Schultz. Both those books are really good. So Adam Grant talks about metacognition, the ability to think about our own thinking, which is what we're trying to do right now. And he advocates for something he calls rethinking and unlearning, to the point where he says, quote, rethinking has become central to my sense of self, unquote. Now, compare that to some of what we looked at last time. We looked at ourselves as having a sense of self as someone who's always right. How about a sense of self where I'm always rethinking? Feels very different to me. So I want you to hear from Adam Grant himself. So Barbara's going to show us a clip, about 3-minute clip with him.
How do we convince ourselves to attach our outcome to more of our values than our beliefs? Like attach our identity to values and not beliefs. Like that's a tricky path, isn't it?
Do you think so?
I don't know. Like how do you, well, it seems like it is. Otherwise we'd just be rethinking all the time.
I mean, that isn't that part of the fun of being human, though? Like,
But
to
we
me,
don't.
rethinking is it's code for learning, isn't it?
Well, it is, but we don't update our views very often. That's part of the issue, our own and others, right? It's hard to see it when we don't do it. It's really easy to see when others don't do it. But maybe we're 50-50, right? Like how do we nudge that forward so it's like 70% of the time we're open to updating our views, and what is the process by which we update our views?
That's a great question. So the way that I've landed at thinking about this is to say, look, when you have a belief, you have 2 options. One is you can subject it to a rethinking cycle. The other is you can fall victim to an overconfidence cycle. So an overconfidence cycle is, something we've all both committed and witnessed probably too many times. But The basic idea is we start by being proud of something that we think we know. And that leads us then to feel a lot of conviction. That kind of launches us into confirmation bias, where we look for information that confirms our expectations, as well as desirability bias, where we look for information that basically reinforces what we want to be true. And then we see what we expected to see and what we wanted to see, and we get validated, and that only makes us prouder of what we know and less open to rethinking. The rethinking cycle is very much the opposite. It starts for me with intellectual humility, which is about knowing what you don't know. So you know, no matter how much of an expert you are in a given field or a given topic, you have a long list of things that you're clueless about. And being aware of what your ignorance is leads you to doubt your convictions. It makes you curious about what you don't know. And that opens your mind to new discoveries. And then every time you learn something new, it's not this sign that, oh, now I'm an expert. It's this sense that, well, there's so much more to learn, right? And I've made a tiny, tiny dot of progress in, you know, a whole universe of knowledge. And I can't wait to see what I learn next.
Part of learning to rethink is knowing that it's okay to be wrong, that we saw last time, to be unsure, not to know, or even just be able to change our minds on something we thought we were sure about. Changing our minds means we were wrong about something in the past. We've prepared the ground so far talking about humility, and humility is the first step for being able to rethink things, along with needing to be right, being triggered, and getting defensive. So we're prepping our teacups. Barbara, can you show the slide, please? So you see this, I love this slide. This is from Adam Grant's book. Things I know, very little, things I know, things I think I know, and things I don't know. There's so much more that we can't know than we can know. Okay, Barbara, thanks. Grant talks about having cognitive flexibility, and I pulled this quote from Malcolm Gladwell, who's an author I really like. And he says, I feel I change my mind all the time. And I sort of feel that's your responsibility as a person, as a human being, to constantly be updating your positions on as many things as possible. And if you don't contradict yourself on a regular basis, then you know you're not thinking. So if I'm not changing my mind regularly, I can know I'm not thinking. And one of the things I realized very early in my journey in this bridging world is that most of the opinions and conclusions I had formed were about 20 years old. And so I never gave myself the upgrades. Adam Grant says, we favor the comfort of conviction over the discomfort of doubt. We still cling to opinions that we formed in 1995. We listen to views that make us feel good instead of ideas that make us think hard. So for me to think about another point of view that is counter to what I already think, I have to be able to allow for the possibility that I might be wrong. And if I'm not okay with the possibility of being wrong, I won't be able to risk taking in possibly contrary information, which is part of being able to rethink and unlearn. Are you following the kind of naughtiness of this, the kind of catch-22? And I do want to really emphasize what I talked about last time. This stuff going against our wiring like this can create a lot of wobbliness and shakiness. And like I said, for me, one of the things that really used to get me when I'd start changing my mind about things, realizing I had a limited opinion. If I was wrong about this thing, what if I'm wrong about everything? And in that too, what as Adam Grant points to, and one of the videos we saw last time, it changes our sense of self. Now, for me, it's been a tremendous positive change of self, much more expansive, much more relaxed. And I'll say to you who are continuing with this class after last time, the fact that you're here again says a lot about your character and your courage. So I really appreciate that you're here. Um, Barbara, can you show the next slide, please? So social scientists have discovered in the last bit of time 188 ways our minds play tricks on us. We're not going to be able to get through all of them. And I'm going to send you the link to this so you could, if you want to see, because obviously you can't read, this is too small. But these are the ways that our minds automatically get in the way of rethinking and get in the way of actually considering new information. So automatically means we're not making a conscious choice. We're trying to make the unconscious conscious, so we have more free will, we have more choice in how we comport ourselves. So I just want to give a few highlights. A really important concept to understand, if you haven't heard this already, is something called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is the feeling that we get when we're confronted with new information that opposes what we already believe. And sometimes these beliefs are very sacred. They call them sacred cows. They're almost untouchable, they're untractable. Now, different people experience cognitive dissonance differently. Me, I get very confused and very fuzzy, especially if the opinion is coming from somebody I value. I get very conflicted and I get weepy. It doesn't feel very nice. But the good thing about knowing what it is when it happens now, I know what's going on. I know there's an inner conflict because there's something I don't want to take in. The other thing I want to define, which Adam Grant mentioned, is something called confirmation bias, or it could be called my side bias also. And that is our tendency to embrace and believe in information that confirms what we already believe. And then inversely, there's something called disconfirmation bias, which means when I reject information that I don't want to believe. So these are really important to understand when they're happening. They're easy to see it in other people, but not so much in ourselves. The other thing that I'm going to show a clip in a minute, but there's something else that's really very crucial for us to understand. That's something called the availability bias. It actually means if you hear something often enough, whether it's true or not, you're going to believe it's true. So Barbara, can you show that clip now? This is a little longer. This is about an 8-minute clip.
Research has shown that if you're repeatedly exposed to the phrase, the body temperature of a chicken, that's right, the body temperature of a chicken, even if no useful information is given about the body temperature of a chicken, you are more likely to judge as true this statement: the body temperature of a chicken is 34 degrees Celsius. It's not, by the way, it's actually closer to 41. But this finding highlights an important aspect of our psychology that plays a huge role in how we see the world. The things we're exposed to repeatedly feel more true. Now, the way this seems to work is through a mechanism called cognitive ease. Cognitive ease is a measure of how hard your brain is working, from easy, like when you're scrolling through Facebook, to hard, like if you're trying to multiply 14 times 37 in your head. Things that are true generally elicit cognitive ease, like fire is hot, Earth revolves around the sun, dogs have 4 legs, and so on. Not only do these things feel true, they also feel familiar, effortless, and they feel good. All of these are outcomes of cognitive ease. Now, the trouble arises because cognitive ease can be artificially created in other ways. One way is just by repeating the stimulus. In a classic experiment at 2 Michigan universities, experimenters took out ads in the school newspapers. Each ad consisted only of one of these nonsense words.
Cardiga, Sarisic, Baiwani, Nansoma, Iktitaf.
They were printed with different frequencies. One word appeared in the paper only once, while others appeared 2, 5, 10, or 25 times. The word frequencies were reversed at the other university. At the end of the experiment, researchers sent out questionnaires asking people to rate the meaning of each of these nonsense words on a scale from "it means something good" to "it means something bad." And the findings were clear. The more frequently the word had appeared in the newspaper, the more people felt it meant something good. So with enough repetition, even a nonsense word comes to feel familiar. It triggers cognitive ease and overall feelings of goodness. Experiments have shown that this also works when showing English speakers Chinese characters or even random shapes. And the finding is even more general than that. Songs are judged more favorably after you've listened to them a bunch of times than on the first listening, and participants looking at yearbook photos judge the people in the photos as more likable after seeing that photo more times. Which that brings up the question, what are the Kardashians famous for? Depending on who you ask, you may find that they're famous for nothing or just famous for being famous, but really they are famous for exactly the same reason anyone is famous, and that's because you've heard their names and seen their faces over and over again. Now, they are familiar, you have experience with them in the past, and therefore they are processed with cognitive ease, which also feels good. This is at the core of the advertising industry, the idea that repeated often enough, even brown carbonated sugar water seems really appealing. But maybe it shouldn't be surprising that repeated stimuli are perceived more favorably. After all, our brains have evolved to identify threats, and anything novel is a potential threat. But if after repeated exposure nothing bad happens, it becomes familiar and comfortable and therefore a sign of safety rather than a threat. And this general phenomenon extends beyond humans. Chicks who were played a tone when they were in the egg later made fewer distress calls when the same tone was played to them as chicks. But repetition is not the only way to create cognitive ease. Images with higher contrast are perceived by the brain with more cognitive ease, making them feel good, which explains most of the Instagram filters. In another study, people who were shown images where the outline was projected quickly and imperceptibly before the image, they started to smile and they relaxed their brows as measured by electrodes on these muscles. Videos with bad audio quality and low contrast create cognitive strain as you try to figure out what's going on, possibly searching for threats. You may not have noticed just now, but your brows probably furrowed and your mouth started to frown, which is why we prefer high contrast video with crisp audio. And the same applies to text. So which of these statements do you think is true? Well, actually, it's a trick question. He was born in 1879. But studies have shown that people will often choose the more legible answer. Nice, contrasty, bold text is easier and quicker to read. It's handled with more cognitive ease and is therefore judged to be more true. Lawyers with easily pronounced last names are overrepresented higher up the chain in law firms, even controlling for rarity and ethnicity of the names. And even companies that have pronounceable abbreviations on the stock market outperform those with unpronounceable tags, which you'll be happy to know if you have stock in those companies. And being happy, in fact, that makes you more likely to experience cognitive ease as well. This in turn makes you more intuitive. Try this. What connects these three things? Cottage Swiss cake. All English speakers recognize a unique solution, cheese. How about sky bulb high? The answer is light. Now, not all sets of three words share a connection, of course, but what's amazing is experiments have shown people can determine whether they do or not in only a few seconds, long before they figure out what the actual association is. This is due to the sensation of cognitive ease. Somewhere deep in the brain, these associations cause a flicker of recognition, which feels pleasant. It's the same reason why people say to go with your gut on multiple choice tests if you're not exactly sure of the answer. Now, is this true or false?
All roses are flowers. Some flowers fade quickly. Therefore, some roses fade quickly.
Yeah.
I would say that follows. One would think it would be true.
But I got a feeling it's not.
The actual answer is false. Roses aren't necessarily the some flowers that fade quickly. A test using a similar set of 3 questions found that 90% of people made at least one mistake when the questions were printed clearly. But when the test was printed like this, the error rate dropped to 35%. Making the test harder to read actually increased the accuracy of results. This is because the illegible text creates cognitive strain, forcing your brain to work harder, and that helps avoid the pitfall of jumping to the intuitive but wrong answer. Cognitive ease is useful for being creative and intuitive, but it also makes you more gullible. So for the written part of your driving test, going with your gut is probably a good strategy. But in areas like physics, where the answers are counterintuitive and there are many common misconceptions, it's important to be more skeptical. This vigilance takes effort, and it's also associated with being unhappy. Have you ever noticed that some of the best scientists and analytical minds are grumpy and suspicious of everything? I mean, I think this could be more than just poor social skills. It may be essential for them to do their job. And this is a paradox of learning and critical thinking. Cognitive ease is pleasant. It is effortless, familiar, and it really does make you more creative and intuitive. But it can also trick you. It may make things seem true that aren't, and you may feel like you're learning when you're not. On the other hand, being skeptical and analytical takes more mental work. It's more confusing and it doesn't feel as good, but it's the best way to separate fact from fiction. Now, you might think that the point of this video is to say that we all need to think critically more often, but that's not it. As an analytical thinker myself, I find it takes me like half an hour just to select a toothbrush. There are definitely times when cognitive ease is the appropriate mental state. I mean, we evolved it for a reason so we can react intuitively in familiar everyday situations. Why think harder than you have to? So the key is to identify those times when more thought is required. But with sharing and repeating ideas easier than ever before, I think we need to be more vigilant to distinguish between those things that are really true and those we've simply heard many times before. The more something is repeated, the more it starts to feel true.
So there's a lot of food for thought in that clip. I just want to expose you to as much as I can in this period of time. So I want to talk about this notion of shortcuts. A lot of these tricks our minds play on us are to provide shortcuts. And a lot of this is because we need, our brains are set up to conserve energy. We only have so much bandwidth, so much energy, so we've got to use it wisely. And this all happens automatically. So there's 4 different ways that these things happen. I'm going to send you also an article if you want to dig deeper. You don't have to read this. But there's 4 basic ways. One is information overload. There's just too much information. We've got to shortcut and figure out what we don't need to know and make assumptions. The other thing is that we are meaning-making mammals as humans. So we want to understand, we want to connect the dots. And many times we're connecting the dots quickly and inaccurately. So this happens a lot for cause and effect. We think if 2 things happen simultaneously and they're somehow close to each other related, we can think one caused the other. There's tons of examples of how this has gone really wrong, and even policy making and things like that. The third way is we need to act quickly, or at least we think we do. A lot of times now I realize I want to make decisions quickly so I can just forget about it, but sleeping on things really helps. The other thing, the 4th thing, is generalizations over specifics. Generalizations, I'm going to talk about more next time. They're really counterproductive. Again, there's a shortcut, but so often we get ourselves in trouble. And I'll talk about it more next time. So I want to go into one aspect of psychology. And can you show the slide, Barbara, please? There's something in psychology called splitting. And we can also know that this as black and white thinking or binary thinking, either or instead of both and thinking. So for instance, it can be, I'm good, you're bad, my side's right, your side's wrong. And one thing that this does out of many is it mitigates this inner conflict of cognitive dissonance. Grant calls this binary bias. He says a basic human tendency to seek clarity and closure, and I would say avoid painful feelings, by simplifying a complex continuum into 2 categories. So your brain cares more about harmony and ease than truth. I think, and I don't like to be reductionistic, but I almost think that splitting is the foundation of our polarization, making everything into good, bad, right, wrong. And there's another aspect to splitting that I want to talk about, and that's called projection, which some of you might know about. I'm going to give a personal example. I used to be married to Tom. And one of the things that I felt most ashamed about myself is when I felt incompetent or when I thought I was being perceived as incompetent. I have a lot of shame around that. And I'm sorry to say that in my marriage, until I caught myself probably about halfway through, I would do something really terrible. And I would set Tom up to solve a problem, say, and so I didn't have to deal with it. And then I would judge him as being incompetent. And it took me a long time to realize it was my own incompetence that I was projecting on him. And it was like, whatever that is, I don't want to be that. And it made me feel superior and powerful and competent. So this is the another side to this, not feeling our shame is to project it outwards. So the opposite of splitting is nuance, right? Splitting has two choices. Nuance has a variety of gray. And I encourage you in this next couple of weeks to notice when you're splitting and to try to nudge yourself towards nuance, but be gentle with yourself because there might be shame involved. We don't want to push it too much. Just noticing is a big deal. And finally, the last thing I want to cover, because it's really rampant, is something called emotional reasoning. And basically, it goes something like this. I feel that X is true and right, and therefore X must be true and right. And the problem is our emotions play tricks on us too. Adam Grant says, when it comes to our own knowledge and opinions, we often favor feeling right over being right. Now, this is really tricky territory because there is such thing as intuition and good hunches and gut feelings that turn out to be absolutely true. Some people call this, think what happens is we have these unconscious recognitions, these pattern recognitions that we're processing so quickly we don't even know we are. But however it comes, sometimes we know things and we don't know how we know them, and they happen to be accurate. However, a lot of times it's not. So I know part of my own journey has been really parsing out when is it a genuine, reliable intuition, and when is it something like wishful thinking or my old unconscious material, like thinking Tom was incompetent, personal history, biases, filters, preconceptions, and all of that. A good example that I have, and I've seen it in friends, I've seen it in myself, where there were many times in my life where I thought somebody was absolutely my soulmate. It was like a thunderbolt, and I knew this was the one, and yet a couple months later, like, oh, I got that wrong. So there's lots of times we have very strong feelings and we think we're understanding reality and we're not. And even when we're triggered, that can feel like we're right, and it can feel very self-righteous too. So I'm going to end this here because I know I've given you a lot. And what we're going to do is take a break until 3 o'clock, and then we'll do the exercise.